Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to visit our website at inclusiveiowa.org for information on upcoming events and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
In 2023 now makes income discrimination legal across the state. This session will explore the impact of the new law during the past year and the impact it's had on Iowa's more vulnerable communities. I want to start off by recognizing our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, who has been with us since the beginning of Iowa Ideas and continues to be a partner that believes in the power of these conversations, of journalism, and of moving our communities forward in positive directions. I also want to thank Human and Social Services track sponsor Tanager, which was integral this year to involve more nonprofits locally and statewide in our conference. I also want to thank DEI sponsor Inclusive ICR, which has been with us as the track level sponsor for DEI for the second year in a row. Now I want to turn it over to our esteemed panel to introduce themselves, their background, and their connections to this issue. We have one panelist who might be a little bit late to the party, but we're going to lead things off with Len Sandler.
Good morning, everyone. I guess I'm the early bird. My name is Len Sandler, and I am a clinical professor at the University of Iowa, which means I supervise second and third year law students and represent people and do a lot of work on policy and legislation. And in particular on this, we helped draft several of the lawful source of income laws that the state legislature decided they were going to limit as much as possible. So I have the legal vantage point of it, and I welcome your questions and comments as well as we go along.
Jack?
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for those that are listening. I'm Jack Hatch. I'm a former state senator, and presently I am principal for Hatch, Kiernan, Galloway Development Company in Des Moines. We are a low-income housing developer, and that is different from commercial developers, condo developers, home building developers. If you think of the two extremes, my company works on the low-income housing, where Donald Trump works on the commercial housing. We are opposed and in opposite directions in business as well as in life. So that may provide you some consternation or some praise. I don't know either way. But we have built about 15 low-income housing projects in Iowa, from Dubuque to Winterset, new buildings, historic renovations, all housing low-income Iowans through the tax credit, federal tax credit funding.
Thank you, Jack. Christine?
Hi, I'm Christine Hayes. I'm the Director of Development and Communications at Shelter House. By way of background, I studied urban and regional planning with a housing focus in graduate school. Also a lawyer by training, but not by practice. So that informs the work that I'm doing. Shelter House helps folks who are experiencing at risk of and exiting homelessness in our community. So we are pretty entrenched in this and all issues related to housing and homelessness in our community and at the national level.
Thank you all for being with us. And if Carrie is able to join us from the United Way, we will give her a chance to introduce herself as well. Len, I want to lead things off with you giving some background on the legal change referenced in the session description. Can you give us some insight on, oh, there's Carrie right there. We'll pause before we dive into that first question and let her have a chance to introduce herself.
Hi, good morning. Can you all hear me? Sorry, I just got access to be able to unmute myself, so that was good too, and be able to turn on my camera. So I am Carrie Chase. I'm the Vice President of Community Impact at United Way of East Central Iowa. We are a 5-county United Way, encompassing Lynn, Cedar, Iowa, Benton, and Jones County, and have been really determined to help with our affordable housing as it has continued to be the #1 issue in our community.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, so you made it in the nick of time. You missed a little bit of intro, but we're just diving in here. And Len, I want to lead off with you, giving some background on the legal change referenced in the session description. Can you give us some insight on that change and what the impacts have been already and what they're expected to be in the coming years?
Okay, and this is I'm known as the free lawyer, so I'll just give you what I know about this. Okay, the first thing is it's never been unlawful to discriminate based on wealth or low income. It's not a protected class, the same as gender identity or race or national origin. So to change the non-discrimination laws, because all of this law goes to whether or not it's a violation of a Civil Rights Act, to treat people not on the amount of income they have, but where they get their money, whether it's from a profession, whether they get it from Social Security, food assistance, veterans benefits, or an occupation, and also alimony, child support. The idea is several cities in Iowa and many around the country changed their fair housing laws to say, landlord, when you vet a client, when you do an intake and you're trying to evaluate their ability to be a tenant, we want you to not discriminate based on the source of income, where you get your money from. And that included housing vouchers, because as far as discrimination, when someone has a housing voucher, a lot of times laws saying you can't use a voucher are based on race as a proxy, that people associate Section 8 vouchers with poor African American or Latino people of color, and they also bring this bundle of biases that come with it, whether it's drug use, unlawful immigration, all of these things, which made it very difficult for people, especially poor people, to rent an apartment, because the landlords would always say, well, no, because you're on SSI or you're on child support. So Marion, Iowa City, Des Moines passed ordinances saying you cannot discriminate. You have to treat all applicants the same and apply the same income formulas and set the same application criteria. But you don't give a preference to anybody or punish them because of where they're getting their money. And landlord lobbies and national realtors and other organizations created this copycat law that Iowa adopted. And what it actually says, cities and counties cannot enforce any one of these laws that would require a landlord to take a Section 8 or other HUD voucher, which essentially means that eliminates people in the lowest income levels and people with large families from ever being able to rent or buy a house. And it's a copycat law, which means it was a national initiative to do so. Okay, but the laws don't mean that cities cannot continue to use these laws to protect people with SSI and child support, alimony, TANF, food stamps, unemployment compensation. It just means they can't use an ordinance to forbid Section 8. So Iowa City changed its law to say, we're not going to include vouchers unless and until the court overrules it or the legislature changes it. Des Moines law doesn't have any kind of way to allow Section 8 vouchers now. So either Des Moines has to change its law to say any other source of income, but not vouchers. So one thing that does is it forbids cities from saying you've got to take this person, leaving people in very low income and veterans and people of just different occupations not being able to get a house. Okay, so the second thing is the double whammy. The United States Supreme Court ruled that it is not cruel and unusual punishment to arrest a person who is homeless or sleeping on the street because they have nowhere else to go. And I think Justice Sotomayor was saying, boy, what a great choice you have. Either you find a place to sleep or you get arrested. And that means that cities now have a right to say, if Len can't find a place to live, I can arrest you. And some cities are passing those ordinances. And that really just makes it impossible for people to find housing and also to end up in jail. So the legal background is the change in the state law really hasn't helped or hindered the availability of apartments or housing stock. So the law hasn't helped. The Supreme Court, as long as cities don't pass laws saying and start arresting people, then I'm not sure the Supreme Court decision will have much. So let's put the law out of the picture, I think, unless you have specific questions, because the issue is, in light of these, how do people increase the housing stock of affordable housing for people, especially with low income?
Thank you for that perspective. It's always good to know that all the time that we put into writing the session descriptions sometimes. Good intentions, but I appreciate that perspective. So you did a nice job of summarizing, what has changed and where we are right now. Let's talk a little bit about the differences in communities. And you did touch on this a little bit, Len, but the differences in communities across Iowa right now, in terms of Cedar Rapids, Des Moines, Iowa City, what's going on in these different locations, and how are communities being impacted?
Well, I could start that discussion by asking the audience if you know what affordable housing is. Because I've had conversations, many conversations, several with city councilmen and state legislators, and they have asked me what is affordable housing. Now, they're the ones in charge of policy, and they're confused. So I've broken this down into 4 definitions, and if there's one thing that I like the audience to take from my presentation are these 4 definitions of affordable housing. First is what we call middle housing. Middle housing is a person needs minimal help with a mortgage. That's what some people think affordable housing is. I can't afford a mortgage, so I need help. So there are some cities and counties and states that are creating programs to help the middle housing group. Then there's the workforce housing. Workforce housing, they need minimal help with their rent. So now we're beginning to get to what we generally think of as low-income housing. But workforce housing, the people are working, the families are working, the spouses are working, the parents are working, not enough to have a full amount of money to pay for monthly rent. They may need minimal help, but that is what we call workforce housing. The third definition is low-income housing, and that's what my company specializes in. And low-income housing is really for people below the average median income. And this is when you get into the madrid of rules and regulations. HUD has guidelines for every county and every SMSA on what constitutes average median income. So what we have in Des Moines is different from Cedar Rapids or Iowa City or Boone or Jones County. And there are documents that show that. But that's broken down into four categories: 80% of median income, 60% of median income, 40% of median income, and 30% of median income. Those four categories represent the low income families that can get support for their rental places through multiple federal, state, and local programs. Homelessness is at the 30%. So it gets a little bit more complicated because when developers like me come in and we talk about affordable housing for the low income housing, we are really talking about a wide range of people that can be qualified. And the Iowa Finance Authority, who manages these credits, allow for that wide variety from a family of one, for example, in Cedar Rapids, you could have an income of $58,000 and be qualified. Or that family in Cedar Rapids, which is the lowest element of affordable housing criteria at 30%, can have an income of $19,900. Now, that lower category represents $9.40 an hour. That is really low income. And those people don't always have steady employment. That is the category we're talking about with homelessness. Those are the people that fall into that category and have a wide variety of opportunities. But then, as Christine and Carrie can tell you, these folks are living not only paycheck to paycheck, they're living without money and asking for help at every level. And developers in my industry don't really build for that category. We're landlords and we work with low-income families, but the very, very low-income individuals have many other supportive services needs that they need: mental health, health care, education, job training, employment. And so this is the population that I think we're really talking about, that I like to have our elected officials really focus in. Those people at the lowest level of low-income housing criteria that I call low-income housing or affordable housing. That's my definition. Policymakers need to know that when they go out and campaign for affordable housing, 80% of the people think they're talking to them because they need help on mortgage. And we advocates for very low income are really saying, no, we need shelters, we need long-term permanent low income housing with supportive services. That is not being built very quickly at all. And so, and my last comment is, if you look at every county that has a statistics, the number of homelessness are going up. In Des Moines, it went up from 712 to 774 in the last 6 months. And it's not going to get better. And so arresting people is not going to solve the problem. It maybe will help us focus that they've got to do something more.
Tony, would it be okay if can I kind of contextualize that?
Yeah. I'm ready when you're done.
Okay, great. So for a lay audience, right? So both Len and Jack are talking about pretty technical things that are really, really important from a policy perspective. And I would imagine most of the folks who are listening are people who care about the issue. So for a lay audience, there are a few definitions that I think are your baseline. And one is that in the United States, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has defined housing with one single definition. So Jack's talking LIHTC definitions, which is really, really important for tax credit developers that actually makes it happen. But affordable housing is any housing that you are spending at or less than 30% of your monthly income on all housing expenses. So that's your rent, it's your mortgage, it's your water, it's your utilities. So what's affordable to you isn't necessarily what allows you to do what you want with your extra money or anything else. It is whether or not you're spending, you as a person, 30% or less on income. Now, homelessness can ultimately happen regardless, right? No matter what you are earning, the cause of your homelessness as a baseline, we say homelessness is a housing problem because ultimately, if you are experiencing homelessness, it is because you do not have access to housing that you can afford. There's a caveat on that, right? Which is that people often have limited experiences of homelessness based on domestic violence, family conflict, high medical bills. So there can be those acute experiences of homelessness for someone who would normally have access to housing based on their income, but that's not always the case. We have seen an increase in our AMI of folks we serve. We used to only serve people at or below 30% of area median income. Since we've expanded to do homelessness prevention work, which is to say, hey, let's keep you in your house rather than wait for you to experience homelessness and then provide you assistance, we're helping some more folks who are maybe even up to 50% of area median income because everyone experiences crisis, right? This happens to everyone across the board. And obviously, it's really hard not to latch on to Jack's comment about no one is building below 30% of area median income. That's just the truth, right? It is a serious market failure that anyone who is earning at or below 30% of area median is going to struggle to find housing. And it takes organizations like, frankly, Shelter House. We've built 2 buildings that are for people who are exiting chronic homelessness. Again, a technical definition that we don't necessarily need to go into at this time. But even that, we're looking at people who are like at 0 to 10% of income that we're building housing for. But we've built 60 units, and that's great, and it's has made a huge dent in the people who are experiencing chronic homelessness in our community. But it's a hard thing to build your way out of when the market failure is as pervasive as it is.
That's great. Thank you, Christine. Carrie, I want to turn to you a little bit because Christine touched on this, but I'm fascinated by kind of the way that organizations like yours have are hit by this and the pull on resources. And you talked a little bit about your priorities, but also where a majority of your resources go when we met earlier. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I definitely am not a housing or homelessness expert, but what we have been able to really look into is kind of that resource and how we're working collaboratively on solutions. And what we know is that when we look at the 4 areas that our United Way specifically funds, it's economic mobility, it's access to healthcare, childhood success, and safety net services. And when we look at those first 3, we really do see those as like the transformational. Those are the programs that we are really hoping that are moving people to where they need to be, where we want them to be, in our transforming lives. When we look at safety net services, those are very, very important. And those are our access to housing, right? Our shelters, how are we keeping people safe? It's access to food. And while these are very, very, very important as a stabilizing, they're not the transformational, they're more a transactional. And so, one of the things that I would love to see from our United Way is that we see less and less resources needed to be pulled into that transactional, that safety net, because we are helping people build themselves along economic mobility or education. They're getting healthcare that's not perpetuating issues. So right now, we definitely see that imbalance. We see a lot of need right now in our community when it comes to more of the crisis and stabilization services.
Thanks, Carrie. I want to loop back to a couple earlier comments from Christine and Jack, and it might seem antithetical, but Christine, you made the point that what Jack was talking about was very technical, and I appreciate you making it accessible for lay people. So At the same time, I think it's important that we understand that there are even elected officials who don't understand these definitions, and that's got to be part of the conversation is how we talk about these things. So I guess if you guys could jump in a little bit on why this should matter to the average person. The average person who doesn't feel like homelessness is a threat to them or a concern for their life in the immediate future, but how it impacts resources that are dedicated to all aspects of their community.
All right,
And
go ahead, Christine.
we can tag team. I'll tag you in just a second. I mean, ultimately, the health and well-being of a community, of everyone in the community, impacts everyone in the community, right? Which messy statement, but also just a pure fact. When we have people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and let's talk about let's reference Grants Pass. Let's talk about the probability of someone potentially being arrested for experiencing homelessness. It's not just a simple transaction. It might look like, hey, buddy, we need you to move. Okay, we're going to arrest you. But the reality is the resources involved are the police department, they're the jail. That means there's a public defender. That means there's a prosecutor. There might or might not be a hospitalization service involved if there's a mental health crisis. All of those really, really high dollar services are going into moving somebody from a spot on a sidewalk or in a park, someone who's doing no harm and causing no disruption other than the fact of their existence, right? It makes my mind just explode to think about what we're spending our money on. The Iowa Finance Authority is currently funding we're leading the research at Shelter House, but we're working with an organization called the Wilder Research Group out of Minnesota. They do the housing study out of Minneapolis. So we're doing a study on the economic impact of and the return on investment of permanent supportive housing. And we've done a case study prior to opening our first permanent supportive housing unit for individuals experiencing and exiting chronic homelessness. Which showed it is, and there are national studies as well. You can look at the Camden Coalition, you can look at the city of Milwaukee. Like there's a lot of research out there that you can take a peek at, but Iowans like to know what's happening in Iowa. Like everyone else, we want to know how it involves us. But all the research indicates that it's not just cheaper to house people. It is also cheaper with a giant asterisk and bold print and exclamation marks. That includes the cost of the housing. As in putting people in housing, the cost of not just of building it, of maintaining it, is less than the cost of people staying outside and what's incurred in unreimbursed costs to the medical community. So rolling it backwards, right? Item number one, we just should care about people. Right? Like how, as a moral proposition, as human beings, we should want each other to be well. I recognize that's not necessarily a given, but I'm just going to put it out there. I'm going to be bold and say, why wouldn't we care about the people in our community? A community is its people. So that's item number one. Item number two, why aren't we spending the money in places that are ultimately benefiting the individuals who are in crisis, but also those unreimbursed costs trickle back to risk pools in insurance. They trickle back to taxpayers when we're talking about maybe the attorneys or the law enforcement. So we're paying for it no matter what, right? Why don't we pay in the affirmative that ensures community well-being rather than in doing additional harm to people who are already in crisis?
And Christine talked about the amount of opportunities. There is funding available. The Iowa Finance Authority is the kind of the mechanisms for federal and state money to go through, has done a pretty incredible job in trying to disperse money throughout the whole state. So it doesn't go just to Des Moines or Cedar Rapids and the large cities. A lot of smaller towns have participated. Thus, they're beginning to understand that they have a low-income housing crisis as well. It's not just in Iowa City and Des Moines. They have a workforce housing problem and they have a homeless problem. And the federal government came in 2 years ago with the American Recovery Plan. that gave the cities and counties lots of money. And the Iowa Finance Authority, and in my city, Des Moines, they got an allocation, and they specifically targeted to supportive services. They are going through the National Housing Trust Fund money, the American Recovery Plan money, and they're trying to get cities and developers to build these. Now we are building two presently supportive services housing in in Ames through the Bridge Homes, and in the YWCA in Clinton. And they've been funded by the National Housing Trust Fund in a higher allocation than they did before. And it's taking us 3 years from the time we had our first discussion to just breaking ground. So this is not something people make decisions on very quickly. The community in Clinton, the city of Clinton, the Board of Supervisors of Clinton County, all agreed on providing money, but it was an arduous process to convince them that they weren't going to get blowback from their citizens. And when we thought we had it completed, we did get blowback. They thought a homeless shelter or a supportive services housing facility was going to lower their property taxes, create crime. Those are the biases that Len talked about that led toward those state and federal laws. So the community has a lot of interest in this, and because you and you're not going to avoid it by living in the suburbs. There are low income projects out in the suburbs. There are shelters being planned for the suburbs. We have to act and try to work out these issues. But if you don't know the definition, if you don't know who you're helping, then you can't really get to the biases that you have to overcome. And the big bias we see today is the homeless encampments that are really, and I think Len used this, it's really a proxy for racism. And it's also a proxy against the mentally ill. And these are people that need real services, and we can't avoid it by arresting them. That is one of the most inconsistent policies the Des Moines City Council has made in a long, long time. I mean, they've tried to be friendly with affordable housing. They listen to what they have to do, but this last attempt by them was really a desperation. And instead of being desperate to get rid of them by arresting them, they should get desperate by bringing together the different communities, the businesses, and not have another study. We have those, but to set down some really significant strategies where they could deal with the city, the county, the state, nonprofits, foundations, and find locations for building permanent supportive housing for either the transients and shelters or the people who want to have permanent housing. It can be done. And the only thing stopping us is really strong leadership. And that's where it comes right down to. It's the political leadership. And we need to have stronger leaders.
And it's made worse than not in my backyard with the fear mongering during this election, more so than I've seen just in my lifetime, that everybody is going to harm you. It's going to undermine your quality of life. Your family's physical and mental health is going to be harmed because of people who are coming into your neighborhood or people with mental illness. And that makes a lot of landlords just reluctant, and a lot of other tenants, to have people who have a history of mental illness. And I just want to go back, Christy, and people who provide the supportive housing and shelter housing, they just can't fill the demand. And that's why, even though the state law, and I just want to bring it back to the local source of income laws to say, in your community, you can ask your city or your county to enact a local law that just says the landlords can still establish and apply their rules. They can charge an application fee if they want to. They can screen the tenants for criminal background and others. They can reject tenants for poor credit or criminal history. But what they can't do is say, I'm not going to rent you. I just apply, and they see that I'm on SSI, and they can just say, no, I'm not going to accept it. And these laws would say, no, you have to qualify me. And if my SSI and other income meet your requirements, then you have to rent to me as long as I pass it. And that means people that are getting, whether it's vouchers or not, they have mental health, or that shelter house is providing 2 months rent, or that the community is doing that. That's the source of income. And that allows people to at least have a fighting chance of getting an apartment. And if the landlord says, I'm not going to count any of that income, then it would be a violation of the fair housing law. Just as if they said, Len, you're a kid from New York. We don't want New Yorkers, or proxy for Jews, whatever it wants, your race, your national background. They can't do that. And this is saying you can't do it just on where I get my income. And that would include being a lawyer, because a lot of landlords, we were talking about this in major cities, don't want a lawyer because we're a big pain in the rump as far as being a tenant and complaining. And that would also be unlawful, but it rarely comes up. The other part is maintaining the housing. And I think everyone said it's easy to become homeless, right? If you have behaviors or a landlord doesn't want to renew your lease, the idea is this is where legal aid and other people to defend against or to provide assistance to tenants who are at risk of being evicted based on either mental illness, but not that would rise to the level of being a danger to somebody. So the idea is in your community to make sure that the cities and the human rights commissions, but the lawyers understand that one of the things they can do to prevent homelessness is to make sure that they actively defend people. Now, if it's non-payment of rent, there isn't much you can do unless the cities provide supports and other income. But homelessness, a lot is because they refuse to renew the lease and do other things. So it's coming in, you want to make sure that people can get through the door and rent the house. And the other thing is keep me in there and make sure that people who are at risk of homelessness don't lose their house because they don't have representation. Because a lot of times in housing court, the people don't show up. And I think that's where supported services help, but when they're no longer staying in a shelter, they do need that. So it's to keep your eye open for that and try to recruit lawyers to do it pro bono as well, or at limited fees.
Tony, would it be helpful to provide an example of the way the Supreme Court ruling intersects with the state level, the law change from 2023?
Sure.
Okay. So if a person is experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness, literal homelessness, and they are ultimately in our community, people don't necessarily recognize that many of the people who are sleeping outside are engaged in services. Our street outreach team works with, if not 100% of the people who are sleeping outside, probably 95. So we're engaged regularly. Many of the people who are sleeping outside, and this is a point that people don't necessarily realize, they have housing vouchers.
Yeah.
They have the means to pay. But now, as of 2023, no one will rent to them. So what that means is a person who has the means to pay rent, but cannot now find a place, because as of January 2023, when that rule went into effect, now not only are they still sleeping outside, they are also at risk of arrest. And then we can loop back into that cycle where we talk about costs and all of those things that sound like exaggerations and they sound like superlatives, but in fact, they're the lived reality of people experiencing homelessness and of taxpayers in our community. Our time from shelter, if we're talking about folks who are sheltered, from shelter to housing, Our goal is for everyone who's in shelter to be housed through our rapid rehousing program or self-resolved within 30 days. Historically, that had not been problematic. We're looking at more like 80 to 90 days now. And while we don't require a landlord to tell us, and a landlord certainly isn't required to tell us why they aren't renting to a particular applicant, I would be hard pressed to say that the timing of this shift in our timing to get folks housed is not related. So we've got people sleeping outside, engaged in services, want to be housed. They don't want to be sheltered, right? Shelter is a chaotic environment. Even a great shelter is a place where 100% of people are experiencing crisis, right? It's hard to go from a quiet park to inside a shelter if you've got a way to get your needs met. So I get that a lot of people make that choice, but these are people who are ready to be housed. They're ready to go from the street into housing. But because of 2023 and that rule that went into effect in January, they can't find housing when that's the only reason for it.
And to make it worse is that there aren't sufficient number of vouchers at all. And the Fed government is cutting back on how many vouchers in the city. Iowa City shut down for several years because they have a waiting list that they won't even take new applications. So people, regardless of their homeless status right now, just even if they have a voucher, landlords sometimes don't want to take them, even though people that have Section 8 vouchers stay longer than other tenants. There's guaranteed income. There are very few additional lease provisions that the landlords have to worry about, and the landlord gets the money, but there aren't enough vouchers to go around. And unless communities start adding additional money or other ways to subsidize this, then people, regardless of people who want to move to a better house as well. I know it's just not homelessness, it's people that need to or have to escape domestic violence or get drug recovery but don't want to be or have to move from a shelter or supported housing. The Johnson County System of Care Group, and I suggest if you don't know about it, you can contact them because a lot of people here are members of that. And that's a consortium of providers and substance use disorder providers, police, prosecutors, housing advocates. And what they do is they look and they examine where the shortfalls in services are, what can be done for people to get care, housing, temporary, full-time, but also get the services they need to address emergencies. As Christy was talking about, mental health or violent behavior where they're going to be arrested. And this group says, what is the proper placement for this individual at the time? And what can be done holistically to make sure that they can get the care, but also find a place to get food and housing. So it's really an entire grouping of support services that people need. And it's also expensive and it's also very intensive labor as well. But in the long run, I think it has reduced the costs of having to institutionalize people. Because a lot of people end up at the University of Iowa in the locked wards. Or if you can't find a bed, right, then you end up somewhere else across the state or you end up on the street.
Or you end up at shelter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they're lucky, shelter
Yep.
compared to others. Yeah.
But Tony, there's one kind of conclusion that I like to make, and I think being a housing developer, a low-income developer, and a permanent supportive services developer, I have a perspective. But the other side of my life was in politics. And as a state senator, there were a few of us that really kind of focused on healthcare. And as a result, Iowa became a leader in healthcare even before Obamacare and through its reorganization of mental health services. And it was that because we had political leaders that took this on as their crusade. I can't give you a name of a politician in the state legislature or in the local governments that I'm aware of, that I would say is a leader in housing. Not one. And because you don't have that advocacy in those meetings and in those subcommittees, then all the advocates around here that are trying to work hard, and there are many of them, United Way in Central Iowa, the United Way in Cedar Rapids, and other communities, they have a collection of advocates and providers, and they're turning out the best they can. But it would be a lot easier if they had included, or we had a champion, multiple levels of county government, city government, suburban government, state government, that could just say this is a priority for all of us, because it really comes down to housing. The health of your community is where people live. The quality of your community is in the quality of where they live. Housing has an enormous impact on schools and education, because there's a high number of kids that transfer from schools within a school year 2 and 3 times because they have to move, because they have to move for their housing. It has a dramatic impact on our lives, from education to employment. And I think the advocates that are listening today should really start thinking about identifying a person in every level of government and go to them and say, we want you to be our champion. And I'll tell you, it doesn't take much to scrub the ego of a politician, to having people like you going and saying, you're going to be our champion. And politicians like to have their offices and their homes decorated with all the awards they got. Make that the award, the champion of housing. And I think you'll get some people understanding what it means. No longer will a city council member have to say, can you help me identify what affordable really means and who we're supposed to be helping? Because they will be advocating to their colleagues on the council or on the board of supervisors or in the legislature.
And
I want to just step in for a second. This is buzzed right past, and we're into our final 15 minutes. If there are questions from the audience, which you guys have retained your audience, and it continues to grow as we go along today. If there are questions from the audience, now's the time to submit them if you want us to have a chance to get to them. But I want to turn to Carrie after what you just said, Jack, and say, like, I know that you guys are looking for advocates, right? I know that you are constantly turning to people and asking them to step in. Just talk a little bit about that and the responses that you get, and why don't we have more people who are housing advocates in elected positions?
Yeah, so I will give you kind of my personal aha moment I had, and then kind of more of like of our Alliance for Equitable Housing. So in Lynn County, we do have that structure of combined ownership of how we are tackling and bringing about solutions for affordable and safe housing, which is a very long process to build, and we are finally getting momentum and have some effective solutions. But everything that we have done has been upon systems change. And so not just slapping a Band-Aid on a certain issue, but really doing the work to get underneath. I always think of that iceberg model, where this is what you see, but it's so many layers deep. And if we don't address some of those things, we're not going to get it. And honestly, I'm glad we spent a lot of time talking about kind of that mental mode, because it is like the key pivotal thing we need to be able to make systems change. And so when we're thinking about perceptions and how people are treating each other in the community, and realizing these are our friends and our family members and our neighbors that are experiencing homelessness or are just struggling to make ends meet or whatever it may be, there is this sense of need to be able to advocate on that, right? And this gets back to my personal thing is I remember I was reading the article, and this is specifically when I think Des Moines had really started talking about making some transitions and criminalizing homelessness. And I saw where some of those sources for that decision came from. And that's when I was able to kind of look in the mirror and be like, shame on us. Like, the only people that our elected officials are hearing are this buzz right here. You know, speaking specifically from Lynn County and the Alliance, we did not do our part in really being able to bring the solutions that we're developing, how we're doing it collaboratively, how it takes every single community member, government official, funder, nonprofit. We all have to come together to do it. So I do think that that was my big aha moment, is shame on me. And also that takes a lot of work, and you really need to make sure you are all swimming in the same line. So I do think that that is a big need, and I do think that we're moving toward that. And I get excited about some of the things that are happening in Lynn County, because we're hoping that we can get to the point where we can start to break down some of those mental modes, that the way people think, with some of the programming and movement that we are hoping to move forward. So I'll stop there and stop talking for a minute.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie.
Just talking about evangelists as well, I really think that's critical, championing this. And I'm not sure that the state level is where that's going to have the greatest results. And the cities and counties really have to stand up and stop the legislature from preempting local laws and the ability to be more flexible with regard to housing and to protect tenants. Mobile manufactured housing, mobile home parks are probably one of the last ownership for affordable housing. And my aha disappointment, after 4 years, we were trying to have tenants get additional rights because people own their home, but they rent the land underneath. And equity firms came in and they just jacked up the rent, sometimes 60% a year. They don't have to take Section 8 because that's already, the federal courts have said that it's not disability discrimination to deny some a voucher. But we wanted a minimum 1-year lease for a person. So in the event they decide to move or they're being forced to move, it costs up to $15,000 to move their home. And then they have to find another place, mobile home park, once they're uprooted. And the legislature, under the law, it used to be that a landlord could give you 60 days notice for any reason to have you out, as long as it wasn't discriminatory. So that's what landlords could do and would do. So instead of guaranteeing the 1-year lease, the legislature added 30 more days. So now a person has 90 days to be kicked out of their home and move. And most of the leases are month to month, because the law will not protect them. And both sides of the aisle, that bill was defeated, and there were people from both sides of the aisle that just supported that additional 30 days. So it's a matter of people who you would think, lawmakers, and that might be Democrats or whatever, because it's a single party government. A lot of them didn't stand up on behalf of people who own their homes and can be evicted in now 90 days. So to me, that was my aha moment, that until things change, the local city, counties, and communities are where you have to go to build that consensus that Carrie was saying, so you can approach the state. Because Jack was right. It used to be 6 people would call a lawmaker and they'd say, okay, I'll support that bill, and I'll actually support it. I learned in Iowa when I moved here, when you have someone that files a bill and says they're the sponsor, they don't do anything beyond sponsorship. There is no, they do not, in other states, when someone sponsored a bill, they moved it and pushed it. Here, when they sponsor a bill, their name goes on it. So I agree, for now, start local and then go state. But that's just my personal bias as a free lawyer and a member of this community.
Yeah. And it's also a source of hope, right?
Yeah.
The idea that we can work with the people who we see at the grocery store, who we see at the movies, and who we see at community events. I can say very plainly that the reason Shelter House has been able to accomplish some of the truly remarkable things that we've done. I mean, Cross Park Place, our permanent supportive housing building, was the first one in the state of Iowa that followed a housing first model. Yes, it was support from the National Housing Trust Fund and the Iowa Finance Authority, but also the reason we've been able to continue that work is that the city of Iowa City puts their money where their mouth is. They are incredibly supportive of our work. We get support from the county, from the other municipalities. It takes truly all of it. And the city's support for our work has been peerless in terms of what one might expect to get from a municipal government in really, really hard financial times. I mean, we built the building that I'm currently sitting in 12 months in the middle of a global pandemic. And we're able to get 36 people who were sleeping outside inside because of that support. So yes, it's maddening to see what's happening at the national level, and it's maddening to see what's happening at the state level, and sometimes at the local level too. But also our ability to find people and to show up at council meetings and to have our voices heard. It's a source of optimism when I will be frank and say I very rarely dance with optimism. Realism is my eternal dance partner, and still there's hope. It's there.
And putting your money where your mouth is,
Seriously.
Iowa City just did it because they
Yep.
just buying two
Yep.
properties and they're going to make sure that affordable housing, and I'm not sure what the definition they're using is, but for me
The
right
HUD
now,
definition.
it is going to be more units of housing
Yep.
for people. And that's the city's power, is to see what land they own. And as Jack told us, cities counted to their own land. The idea is, why can't they use it or devote it and build different kinds of housing and make sure they're also, for my universal design, accessible in all respects, so it can be used for the length, as long as the building will last. So it doesn't matter who's going to move in, whether they're tall, short, have mobility impairments, other things. So spend wisely, but kudos to cities that are doing this.
All right, I want to be mindful of time. We have about 4 minutes left here, and I do have a question from the audience, but I want to make sure you all have a chance to make some closing remarks. I wish we could end on a hopeful note like that, Christine, but I'm not sure we'd be doing service to this particular topic
Nope.
if we closed on that. So if we could just go around and if you have any closing notes or encouragement for people to make a difference on their own time. Go ahead,
For
Len.
me? Oh,
Around the room.
Yep.
Len, you're up.
Oh, okay. Just get involved. And I'm always thinking about my granddaughters, right? I want to make sure that they're going to have a place to live and the other generations and a good quality of life, regardless of how it works out for them with money and other things. And you have to be at the table, even if you think you don't have the qualifications or expertise. It's pretty easy to learn, and just hook up with the people in these groups, and the organizations locally. So to me, I'm optimistic in that. And as we say in Boston, don't let the bastards get you down. Because it's easy. That was not profanity. There was an asterisk and a D.
Carrie, you're up.
Yeah, I'm gonna maybe not positive, but I would say hopeful, picking off Christine's kind of just building that hope. What I have seen is when we started talking about the need and bringing solutions, you start to see your community being involved. And we have great representation from cities in Lynn County, from the county government. We have been able to really start getting some ball rolling on some pilot projects by some companies in the community that are willing to put up the funds for it. You know, we have taken United Way as specifically in our campaigns. Like, let's talk about a cause. Let's talk about our cause and how you can be part of the solution. So putting it in the hands of people, this is what you can do. And I think that's the first step. And it's not going to go from here to here, but we're going to have these little baby incremental steps that I'm really hope are going to bring us to the outcomes that we want.
Jack and Christine, I have to urge you to go quickly.
Let me just quickly say that 20 years ago, a city councilman in Des Moines said they were going to eliminate homelessness. It has doubled since then. And it's not because of people didn't have help, because we do. It's not because the state or the city didn't have good intentions, because they do. It just takes leadership and a commitment and a compassion to understand that it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And we need strong proposals, bold proposals, strong leadership. And if we have that, I think we're going to get it. We'll do much better.
All right,
Go ahead.
Tony, I see that it's 9:40, so I'm just going to say make noise. You know, don't be quiet in your fight for justice, because ultimately this is housing justice, and it's people's right to live and to be members of their community. And if you care, don't be quiet.
Thank you all so much. I don't have any time to close out, but I thought this was a great discussion and so appreciate your involvement in Iowa Ideas. Thank you, and jump into the next session, everyone.
Thank you to Cedar Rapids Gazette.
Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you.